When I was a young teenager, back in the fall of 2006, me, my family, and my neighbors all started having bizarre encounters with an old man in a dark red minivan. Back then, I used to live on a hill above an old, non-operational fishing village. It was about a 40-minute drive outside of the city along a highway. The highway to the village was a dead end. There was nothing down that way except housing. There weren't even motels or any stores. Most of the houses were homes to elderly people, while the others were abandoned fishing stages that overlooked the water. It was very strange to see anyone that we didn't recognize down in the area, especially from September till May. We would get the odd tourist during the summer months, but never from fall to spring. When I was in middle school, every day after I got home off the bus, I would walk up to the mailbox. It was about a good 15-minute walk along the highway. The mailbox was up the road towards the city. Past my house, there was only about 8 other houses, all on the same side of the road as mine. After those houses, it was just thick trees and marshes. We were right on the very edge of the East Coast, right by the ocean. It was a fog bank all year round. It was rare we would get sunny days. Even when it was sunny in the city, it was still foggy down there. Sometimes the fog was so thick you could barely see a few feet ahead of you. Anyway, one afternoon after school, while I was on my usual trek back home after checking the mailbox, I heard the rattling of a vehicle in the distance. I always walk facing traffic, since my mother would have a fit if I didn't. It was crawling towards me, its headlights clearing the fog. It was probably going about 5 miles per hour, which was odd considering that the speed limit was about 70. The minivan came to a halt about 10 feet ahead of me. Just stopped right in the middle of the highway. I continued towards it and I figured that it was someone looking for directions. As I neared the window of the car, I could see an old man sitting in the driver's seat. He was of a fairly small build with light gray patches of hair on his head. His eyes were very watery and of a dull blue color.
"Hello, young lady,"
he said in a very soft voice.
"Hi,"
I responded. He started making small chat with me. I really can't remember what, but it was just sort of casual talking. I noticed that he had a small, fluffy white dog in his passenger seat. The thing that really struck me as odd about his dog was its body language. You see, this old man would move his hand a lot while talking, and every time he would quickly move it, his dog would sort of scrunch further back in its seat. The dog seemed a bit afraid of him. Another odd thing was that he always kept his other hand between the 2 seats. I could sort of make out what seemed to be something of a metallic material under his hand. After chatting with me a bit, he slowly turned his head away and then continued up the road towards the city. I shrugged it off, just figuring that he was a relative of someone down in the village, and I continued home. About a week went by without seeing him, and by then, the man was just a memory. I was on my way up to the mailbox when I heard the familiar sound of rattling coming down the road towards me. Him again? I thought. I was a little weirded out by him, so I jumped down into the ditch and I hid in the brush. I watched as he sluggishly drove by. The entire time he was looking around, observing. Sort of like a hunter looking for prey. After he was long out of sight and I couldn't hear his vehicle anymore, I jumped up from the ditch and hurried my way up to the mailbox. The last 6-minute stretch of road had no housing, so it was a pretty isolated walk. After snatching up the mail, I started hurrying back, and that is when I ran into him again, in the worst place possible. The long stretch with no houses. This time, he was coming up the road quite fast. I didn't have time to hide, and he pulled up next to me and said,
"Hello, dearie. Why were you down in the ditch earlier?"
Oh crap, I thought. He had seen me. I thought I had seen a cat down there, I said.
"You like cute animals, dearie? You can get in the back seat and play with my puppy. She loves kids,"
he said, smiling. No thanks, I said as I started to walk away. He reached out of his window and grabbed my arm.
"Please, dearie, I insist. I can drive you home. You live at 2905 Clover Street, right?"
I stood there, dumbfounded. How did he know which house I lived in? I shook him off and I started to run, and he started driving after me. I bolted down the road and I didn't look back. And at the time, my aunt lived a few houses up the road from my house, so I ran into her driveway and I started frantically banging on her door. She came to the door and let me in, and I used her phone and called my mother to come pick me up. After we got home, I told my mom everything. She was very upset and called the police, and they basically told us that they couldn't do anything, especially since we didn't have a license plate number. After that, I wasn't allowed to go on walks. He continued to show up. usually twice a week, right after my bus dropped me off, and he would come driving slowly down the road. One day, my neighbor asked him what he was doing, and he responded,
"Oh, I'm just a lonely gentleman. I saw a woman one day down the road working on her garden, and she just captured my heart."
My neighbor told him that she was married, and he just laughed and said something along the lines of,
"If you want love, you have to work for it,"
and then drove off. My neighbor got the license plate number and called the police. About 40 minutes later, the police came down, but he was long gone by then. Our neighbor waved the police over and talked to them. They told him that the car had been stolen a few months back. Sometime during November, my parents were out in the evening doing yard work. He stopped in front of our yard and was asking my parents where I was. He said that he missed our time together and felt neglected. My parents got really upset and chased him away. A few days later, I was up late at night playing Final Fantasy on the Xbox 360 in my den. The den was on the bottom floor, and I used to keep all blinds open with the lights off in the room. I like looking at the night sky, and people could probably see me through the window since it was facing the street. So there I was, illuminated by the TV, all cuddled up in my big armchair having a late night game session, probably about 2 a.m. And I saw the familiar red minivan coming slowly down the road. When I saw it, I froze. It parked a few feet up the road from my property, in between our house and the house next door. There was a small driveway that led to nowhere, going in between our land. He stopped his car, turned it off, and then came out. I watched in horror as he walked closer to our house. I was terrified, and I pushed myself as far back into the chair as I could, hoping that he couldn't see me. I felt like screaming, but my parents were upstairs, and both were sound sleepers. He paced back and forth in front of our house, and he was looking into the den. Now, this is the extremely strange part. He just stopped in place and then laid down on the side of the road in front of our house. He laid there for a good hour, and I was frozen with fear the entire time. After about an hour, he got up and then strolled back to his car and left. I ran upstairs crying and told my parents. They called the police again, but he was gone by the time that they came. We were all frustrated. The police, despite having his license plate number, couldn't do anything, and this guy was coming around, harassing and terrifying us and our neighbors, and this went on until March. About a month passed without seeing him, and that is when we got the news. Our neighbor, who was good friends with someone that lived down a dead-end side road up a bit further, had been on a walk to his friend's house. He spotted the red minivan off in a driveway off a house that had just been put up for sale. The people had already moved out. He was filled with anger when he saw the minivan, and he ran over. When he got closer, he noticed the blood on the passenger side window. He went to the closest house and used their phone to call 911. He went back over to the car to check it out. The car doors were unlocked. He looked in the window to see the small dog's body, a wallet which had an ID in it, and a bloody wrench wedged between the two seats. He left and waited for the police to arrive. Our neighbor stayed in contact with the police. Apparently, the guy had left in a hurry, leaving his ID behind. It turns out that he had just been released from prison not too long ago for offenses towards minors. We didn't get any details of his crimes though. I felt so horrible for the dog, and I really hope that he never got his hands on another animal again. I sometimes worry that he went on to harass other people the same way that he harassed us. I was heading from Dayton, Ohio up to a show in Cleveland, and about 30 minutes from my destination, my car breaks down. At the time, I was only a 16-year-old guy who was still pretty dependent on his parents, and I knew nothing about cars, so I called my dad and had him arrange the details to get someone to come out for me and my car. After about an hour of waiting, the truck pulls up, and I feel relieved that I'll be able to head home after all the stress, not even so much bummed about the show. I should not have felt relieved, however. At first I thought that he was nothing more than an average neckbeard, until our ride home. To start things off, as soon as I got into his truck, he asked me why I was out here all alone, and if anybody was going to look for me. I realized how weird a question that was, but I proceeded to answer it just to relieve the tension. It was around 7 p.m. when he picked me up, and on the way back, about 30 minutes in, he asked if I wanted to get something to eat from McDonald's, and I said yes. As I'm in line for McDonald's getting my food, I can feel his eyes just staring at me from behind. I turn and glance over my shoulder and notice him looking at me, blatantly licking his lips. At this point, I had no idea what to do. I got my food and I returned to the truck and I tried to keep to myself, since I just wanted the ride to be over. After sitting there in silence for a while, I hear the strangest sentence someone has ever said to me.
If you sit there and act like a deer, I might just gut you like one.
Of course, me feeling defenseless, I just make an awkward chuckle. But then he pulls out his decent-sized pocket knife and he just holds it up by the steering wheel, not threatening me with it, but he was almost admiring it. To break the silence, since I didn't want to be gutted, I asked him if he had any good stories about some of his pickups and drives back. He gives me some story about some girl he took back, and said something about how the walls in her room were blue. This was good to hear because I figured that he wouldn't want to rape me or anything since I was a guy. A bit later, he pulled out his flip phone and asked if I wanted to see something funny, and I said sure. He told me to scoot closer to the middle of the seat, and out of pure stupidity, I did. The first thing he did when I scooted closer was throw his arm over my shoulder faster than I could process what happened. He said it was hard to show me the videos on his phone and drive, so it was easier. The first video he showed me was of some Mexican man or something sitting at a police station looking like he was waiting to be processed in. The man took a sip of a flask out of his jacket and then a gun and shot himself dead. I told him that the video was messed up and not funny at all. He then let out the most maniacal laugh that I have ever heard. I tried to scoot back, but he had a stiff arm to the side of me that I could tell he was not going to move. He then told me that he had better videos. The next one was of a girl having sex with a horse, and apparently this killed her as she fell to the ground flat on her face. He told me that his brother took that video. The last video was of a girl who looked normal at first until the girl reached inside her and pulled out a huge fish. She literally reached in and took out a bass or catfish or something. After we neared the town I lived in, he asked where my apartment was, not knowing how old I was. I said that we would be going to my dad's house, and he immediately stopped the truck and said,
"Just when I thought this was going to be fun."
He pulled over on the side of the road and let my car down about 10 minutes before home. He got back in and told me that this is as far as he can go, and he will see me again soon. I looked at him puzzled. I didn't pay him, and I didn't see how he couldn't drive 10 more minutes, but I didn't care. I got out and he pulled off. My phone was dead, so I proceeded to just walk the rest of the way and make it home. As soon as I walked in, my dad asked where I had been and who brought me home. I told him the story about the creepy truck driver and how terrified I felt. He told me that the tow truck service he called had notified him that I wasn't there when they sent out a driver. It turns out that the man who took me home was just a random guy with a truck, and not from the company that was supposed to take me home. Around 2 years ago, I finally moved into a brand new house in a brand new building estate in Australia. I was one of the first to have a finished build in the area, and I was elated to finally gain independence. The first few weeks went by as normal, and during that time, I'd often take walks alone with the dog in the afternoons and roam the surrounding estate area. All the roads around us had been partially completed and all other properties were marked out, but no other houses were built excluding one that was directly opposite mine. The house looked finished, but there was no driveway laid yet, and from what I could gather, no one lived there. To the left of my house, roughly a few hundred meters away, was a field with a huge hill in it. I later found out that the whole area was council property. Not only was no one allowed to build up there, but the whole hill was basically a no-go zone. For whatever reason, the council just didn't want people on it, so the whole area was surrounded by a huge chain link fence. The only other noticeable feature in the area was a small abandoned farmhouse with a shed a few kilometers down the road. I knew nothing about it, and often went walking there with the dog as it gave me something mild to explore amongst the vast nothingness I was living around. The entire place was dilapidated and completely inhabitable, but it was still interesting nonetheless. About a month or two after moving in, I woke one morning to the sound of a violin. It sounded extremely distant and quite haunting. I actually enjoyed it and assumed that the neighbors opposite me had finally moved in. Excited that I finally had some people to talk to, I peeked out the curtain and saw that the house opposite mine was still as vacant as it ever was. I got dressed, but by the time that I managed to look outside, the violin had stopped. This happened roughly every second day for the next week. The violin would wake me up and then just disappear after about 45 seconds. I'd ignored it to the point where my curiosity simply got the better of me, and the next morning when I heard the violin playing again, I immediately jumped out of bed, threw on my dressing gown, and shot out the front door. I scoured the early morning surroundings, and there, up on the hill, was a figure playing a violin. It was barely light, but the person looked very tall from the distance I was at, and as they were playing, they were doing what can only be described as a waltz-type walk, spinning slowly around in a circle as they played. I took my eyes off the person and walked over to pick up the morning paper, and in the 10 seconds that it took me to do this, I heard the violin stop. When I looked up, I noticed that the figure was no longer playing or dancing, but it was now standing still and most likely looking in my direction. It was so dark that I couldn't make out anything more, and we both just stood there for half a minute not moving before the creeps got the better of me and I went back inside. After that morning, things started happening. On my walks, I began to notice footprints on the surrounding properties that weren't made by me and that I had never seen before, which I just assumed were from people walking up from the other housing areas down the road. I never awoke to the violin, but I swore that I could hear someone walking on the street next to my bedroom window in the early mornings. However, I never saw anything. Other really general things happened as well, like random tools such as spades and rakes laying around the area, which I guess were left there by construction crews, none of which I ever saw. I started getting calls at work that would immediately hang up on me, and I also stopped walking up to the abandoned farmhouse, as the experience with the violin player had me a little shaken. One night as I was heading to bed, I turned off the television in my living room, and again I could hear the faint sound of a violin playing. However, it sounded more muffled and rehearsed. I froze, and a cold chill flowed through me instantly. Considering that it was about midnight and not the usual time I hear it playing, I went to the front window and peeked out to see that there was a light in the house opposite mine. It was clearly a candle, as I could see the dim light flicker in the empty window, and the music sounded like it was coming from an old record player. But in the 10 minutes I watched, I never saw any movement inside the house. I moved away from the window, sufficiently freaked out, and after another 5 minutes, I heard the music abruptly stop. I peeked out again to notice that the light was now out. I never saw anyone. I began to become unsettled in the house, and I would often invite friends over to hang out until late, but of course, nothing would ever happen when someone else was with me. I never bothered to tell any of my friends, as without evidence, I'd figured they'd just give me crap about it and I'd just become more agitated. But nothing compared to what happened next. In my living area, the desk sits right next to a small window which looks out to the fence surrounding my property. The steel fence is literally an arm's length from the house and about 6 feet tall, so I always figured that unlike most of the other windows, I would never need to cover this one with a sheet or blanket because no one would ever see in. I usually had headphones on when I played, and I always had the lights off for no other reason than I preferred to play games in the dark. One night when I was gaming, I got up and walked into the dark kitchen and got a beer out of the fridge. It was dead silent, excluding the faint sound coming out of my headphones. As I closed the fridge and turned around to face the desk, I saw directly out the window 2 very faint lights. I didn't even catch on, and I immediately started walking back to the desk, fixated on the small glowing balls, and it wasn't until I had my nose almost pressed against the glass that I realized that the 2 lights weren't lights at all. They were eyes. A set of eyes sitting just above the fence line, staring wide open at me. They didn't blink, they didn't move, and my entire body locked up. All I could do was simply stare back, as my brain was still comprehending that there was an actual person looking at me in the scariest way I could possibly ever imagine. I don't know what happened, either my head kicked into gear or my muscles loosened up, but my body automatically collapsed and I fell to the floor, scurrying to hide against the wall away from the window. I could hear my heart beating through the carpet like a drum as I tried to lay as flat as possible, and as my mind was still processing the sheer severity of the situation, a violin started playing. That violin and the haunting tune it always emitted started up, except that this time it was directly outside my window and much louder than I had ever heard it before. The lights were still off, and I wanted to get up to turn off the PC screen so I couldn't be seen. My whole body just wasn't ready to cooperate. Not only was the sound of the instrument extraordinarily loud, but it sounded like it was being played with frustration, notes being missed frequently and the strings screeching. The pace of it was getting faster and faster, and by this time my dog Jeb out in the backyard had picked up on the situation and, registering an unfamiliar sound, gave one solitary deep bark. The violin instantly stopped and the house was finally dead silent, excluding my headphones, which I could hear quietly working away. I was still frozen to the carpet, and it wasn't until Jeb had a second menacing bark that I heard the figure outside my window start to walk away in the direction of my yard. Once that first footstep hit the ground, I instantly thought of the welfare of my best mate, and finally my head connected with my extremities and my entire body kicked into overdrive. I leapt from the ground and slid across the laminated floor to the back door where Jeb was standing, staring into the backyard. I ducked to keep low and quietly unlocked and slid open the door. Usually, doing so would notify Jeb that he was allowed inside, but when the door opened up, he didn't move an inch and was completely fixated on the pitch black backyard. Everything told me not to go outside, but there was no chance that I was letting anything happen to my dog, and I moved out into the alfresco, moved behind Jeb, put my hand under his collar, and attempted to back him toward the house. Jeb is a pure Labrador and weighs like a sack of sand, so when he doesn't want to move, it takes a sheer force to pull him in the direction you want him to go, and right now, Jeb wasn't going anywhere. I yanked at his scruff, and as I did, he emitted a bark like I had never heard before, a deep, bellowing sound that elevated my nerves to an all-time high. We both just stood there, waiting for some form of reply, and I couldn't remember how long we both just froze there. But eventually, I heard footsteps from around the side of the house begin to walk away. Not a simple walk, however. Almost like whoever was doing it was slowly dancing in a circle, the footsteps keeping to a beat as they drifted away from the house into the distance. Once I couldn't hear anything, Jeb licked his lips, gave me a look, and wandered back inside. I followed and locked the door behind me and spent the night reverting to my childlike self, hiding under my bed covers with my dog, and I didn't sleep a wink. That was the last time I ever saw or heard the violin player. The following morning, when the sun finally came up, I called into work sick and called the police. They scoured the lot next to mine and found footprints in the dirt. However, there were so many there that it was impossible to tell whose were whose. The only description that I could give to the officer was his height, since he would have to be over 6 feet to stare over the fence at me. But they explained that he could have been standing on something or on his toes. They also told me that they never received a report of anyone playing a violin in the area, or of anyone being in the fenced-off hill either. I essentially looked like an insane person, but the officers were very nice about the whole thing and offered to patrol the area for the next few nights, which helped put my mind at ease. Nothing else has happened since then.